Okay, hello everybody. This is going to be the discussion for week 5's content that would have been held last Thursday, had it not been on Thanksgiving. So I just wanted to go over some of the content that we would have covered in that class session. I did a video that's, I posted the link to YouTube. Hopefully everyone's seen that link that I posted in Brightspace. If you didn't see that, let me know and I'll certainly forward that on to you. That would have covered the material that we probably would have covered had we not had the difficulties, the networking issues in week 4. So hopefully we will have gotten some of these technical issues behind us so we can move forward. My goal here in this video is to try to get through chapters 13 and 14 in the text. 13 deals with fiscal policy. Chapter 14 is sort of an introduction to money, financial institutions, and really sort of an introductory material to get us to the next important topic, which is chapter 16, which we'll cover in our regular Zoom class this Thursday, the 2nd. Okay, so that's where we'll go from there, and then after this Thursday, we should have a fairly modest amount of material yet to cover. There's really only one major area of discussion, and it should result in, I think, a fairly abbreviated class session. I hope, knock on wood, given the fact that we've had so many challenges this term. But it should be a relatively straightforward and not very technical class session in week 7, mostly because what I'm trying to do there is, as always, is to try to tie everything together in terms of what we learn, how does it square with where the state of knowledge is in macroeconomics at the moment and where things are going, and more importantly, I guess, where are the divisions that lie within the theoretical schools of economics. I think that's an important area that, for us to get into. Okay, so anyway, let's pick it up from here. One thing where we're sort of moving now, we've talked about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We were building the first true model of the macroeconomy. We did that last time, and we talked about the fact that we took the regular demand curve and the demand function from some ordinary basic microeconomic model, which is really what we covered beginning in chapter 3 early on in the term. And we've sort of blown that up to expand it to cover all elements of demand throughout the economy. So it's not just demand for a particular good, but it's demand for all goods and services throughout the economy from whatever actor is doing the demanding, whether it's households, business firms, or government, and including foreign buyers as well. And then aggregate supply, we talked about that. We differentiated aggregate supply in the short run from the long run. We're going to get to the long run configuration next time. There's a way of getting to it that I don't want to get too far ahead of the readings. I'll show how that's derived. It's a little bit difficult to follow in the text, I will admit. So I think that that's an area that is best left to a sort of concise discussion dealing with that sort of transmission from short to long run. Okay, so what we're going to do, so now we've covered this issue of model building. We want to sort of look at what to do about policy. And I have long been of the opinion that, what's the point of studying macroeconomics unless you plan to do something about it? And that, I think, has been one of the success stories that economists can point to, frankly, is the idea that there's been so much that's been learned since the Great Depression of the 1930s that a lot of what would have been economic calamities, such as the housing crisis of 2008, the savings and loan crisis of the late 80s, early 90s, might have resulted in full-blown depressions. And I think the evidence for that is the fact that, as I mentioned previously in a class session, that the 19th century saw a number of actual full-blown depressions, not recessions that are just temporary dips in output and income, but rather full-blown breakdowns in the economy that go on for year after year after year, and are oftentimes characterized by something that's really broken structurally, oftentimes having to do with the money supply, with the financial system, or both. And those calamities have largely been avoided since the Great Depression, which is, by the way, when macro sort of started as a separate discipline, sort of a breakaway from micro. Because if you take a micro class prior to the Depression, it would have mostly resembled, or if you took any econ class prior to the Depression, it would have probably resembled one of our micro courses today, with a little bit of discussion of what we're going to be talking about tonight. But in terms of policy, that we're going to be coming to a bit later, and theory about those policies, those were mostly lacking. So when we talk about policy, what we're really talking, and I've said this before, when we talk about policy, what we're really saying is, what is government's role? Because everywhere else in economics, particularly in the micro realm, which itself is fairly large and has probably more people practicing in it than the macro realm, policy can refer to anybody who sets a policy, whether it's a corporation, whether it's an industrial council, whether it's a state government, local government, school board, whatever. But when we talk about macro policy, we're almost always talking about government policy, because when we're talking about macro problems, it's really only government that has the agency and the authority and the ability to do something about it. And that's part of the reality of the situation, is that only government really can solve macro problems. And I want to come back to this idea that we've stressed before, and we emphasized last time. It was also really the focus of chapter 8 in your text. And that was the idea that the two biggest macro problems that exist are inflation on the one hand and unemployment on the other. And we talked about why both are bad. And we talked about them from the context of why it's bad, not just for the individuals directly affected, but why it's bad for everybody in the economy. And so that's really an issue that, those are issues that you should take a look at and be mindful of. And again, there's so much happening right now in macroeconomics in the real world. I think it's interesting that some of these things are playing out. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I want to talk about the two forms of government policy. I think we covered this just very, very briefly earlier in the class. They are fiscal policy and monetary policy. We're going to focus tonight mostly on fiscal policy with just a bit of an introduction to some of the, we're going to lay some of the groundwork for monetary policy, which is going to be the main focus of our discussion on Thursday. So when we talk about government economic policy, of these two forms, fiscal policy is the first that we're going to talk about. And the term fiscal is one that's familiar to everyone. And I think as sort of a rule of thumb here, I think whenever you hear the word fiscal, you should probably think of budget. It almost always deals with what's planned versus what's actual. Any kind of a budget is usually a forward-looking sort of projection as to what inflows and outflows are expected to look like. They're almost always a bit wrong, and sometimes they're very wrong, but that's the way forecasts tend to happen. When we talk about fiscal policy, what we're really talking about here is the actors involved are Congress, and again, we're talking about the federal level, Congress and the president, Congress and the president. So you've got, which is quite a lot of actors. If you consider the 535 members of Congress and one president at a time, then you're talking about quite a lot of people involved in fiscal policy. The thing to know about these actors is that they are elected. They're elected officials, every one of them. And so as a result of this, they have political motivations and political aspirations, and they have desire to leave, particularly in the case of presidents, a desire to leave a legacy as to what he or she has done. And of course, it's only been he's up to this point. A legacy is to, achievements and accomplishments, things for the history book and whatnot. To some similar extent, Congress, but probably a little bit less so. If there was a senior partner in this, I think traditionally over the years, probably Congress has sort of taken the lead. Given the fact that Congress, that's primarily and constitutionally, one of their main objectives is to manage the budget and passing tax laws and spending policies and things of that nature. While the president has a lot of other responsibilities, obviously, as we all know. So fiscal policy deals with Congress and the president. And you're really talking about two different elements of fiscal policy, budget policy, and that is taxation on the one hand. Taxation, we're simply going to refer to taxes as T, and government spending, which is the same G that we have been using up to this point. So the G here is still the same G that we've been using in the expenditures approach to calculating GDP. The C plus I plus G, it's the same thing there. So taxation and government spending are the two elements. Obviously, they're quite different, right? Taxation is an inflow of resources to the government, as we all know, and then government spending is our outflows from the government. And as a result of this, we have a situation where we are constantly looking at what is the balance between those. Do we have balance one way or the other? And in many cases, we do not. In the case in which we have taxation exactly equal or roughly equal, I mean, balancing the penny is probably a pipe dream. But if it exactly equals itself, then we have the two sides equal. We have a balanced budget. Okay. The U.S. economy has not had a balanced budget in a very long time. So as a result of this, the budget is usually not in balance. And so as a result, it's out of balance. And when it is less, when taxation is less than government spending, we have a condition known as a budget deficit. This is a term that's probably familiar to everybody if you've ever watched the news at all and paid any sort of attention to it, or read a newspaper account of what's going on with taxes and the budget and whatnot. When taxes are less than government spending, the economy is running a budget deficit. Now, we're going to be talking a bit later about what to do about a budget deficit, if anything. And again, that was one of our discussion topics, was what to do about a balanced budget. Should the government try to balance the budget? And is it a big deal at all? And there is a substantial amount of debate as to how serious having a budget deficit is, particularly given the fact that for the last almost 60 years, or a little better than 60 years, the U.S. government has in all but, say, 4 years, run a deficit year after year after year after year. There were about 4 years, 3 or 4 years in the late 90s in which the government ran a surplus. And that was a surprise to a lot of people. And a lot of questions arose as to what to do about that. Do we pay off the national debt? Do we do these great things and whatnot? And we'll talk a bit about that here in a minute. So the opposite condition, which is what I just sort of alluded to, is where taxation is greater than government spending, that we have a budget surplus. And that is not typically the case of where we are in our economy. Some economies do run a surplus routinely. Many run a deficit. Many run a deficit, and a deficit that's larger in percentage terms in relation to overall output per year than what the United States runs, and even its national debt, which is the accumulation of the way that nation states fund their deficits, is oftentimes larger than what we have here. And so that leads a lot of people to say, well, is it even a big problem? And so we'll come to that here shortly. Okay, so that's the first form of economic policy. The second is monetary policy. So monetary policy is the strict province of an agency that we'll begin to discuss tonight. I think we've only touched on them just as a glancing sort of way, and that's the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Reserve System is primarily composed of unelected or appointed officials. And we'll get into a bit of the structure of the Fed, simply known as the Fed for short. We'll get into the structure of them, and we'll see how it's both a centralized agency as well as decentralized, in the sense that there's a Federal Reserve Board that is headquartered in Washington, and that makes a lot of policy for the financial system and for the economy as a whole. Those members are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But then there are 12 district banks throughout the country, which is where there's a decentralized part of it. And some of those members from time to time also have a role to play in what goes on with regard to monetary policy. When we talk about monetary policy, what is the definition? If fiscal policy is control and management of government taxation and government spending, then what is monetary policy all about? It is essentially this. It is management and or control of the supply of money and the availability of credit. Supply of money and the availability of credit. And both of those are sort of joined at the hip because credit is a precursor chemical to money. And it's unfortunate in some ways in this. I've had to cut a couple chapters out that I often cover in the full-term courses because I think it gives, even though they're of lesser importance, which is why they're not absolutely critical to have in the 7-week course, but they do sort of give a bit of a background and sort of fill in some of the missing pieces, some of the blanks. And one of those is chapter 15, which is money creation. You're obviously free to read it if you like. Obviously, you're not required to. The other is chapter 11, which sort of builds the groundwork for chapter 12. That's a very complicated chapter. Feel free to read that too, but it's going to be difficult. But chapter 15 is good in the sense that it talks about how money is created, and it's essentially created through the credit function. And there's a slide in the PowerPoint slide package that talks about that. I think there's only one slide dealing with that. It's not a big emphasis in what we're doing here in the fast track course, just because we're trying to get to some of the major highlights. And the only reason I include that in the regular, the full term courses is because it just gives a little bit of extra nuance and a little bit of explanation as to what is going on with respect to credit and its contribution to the money supply. Basically, every time someone borrows money, it's new money that never existed before. And every time somebody repays money, it's taking money out of the system. So the control of that is really the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. And you might say, well, if in fact money creation and money destruction, which is the repayment feature of the money supply, is done in private hands, and how can government possibly be involved in that? And that's really the trick. And so we'll talk about what that's about. Some of that's going to be coming up in the week 6 module as we get into talking about that a bit more. Okay, so those are the two forms of government economic policy. I want to talk a bit about some of the content that we got to with regard to balanced budgets, and that is the idea of budget philosophies. And I mentioned here just a minute ago that there is a lot of debate as to the fact that as to what to do about a budget that's out of balance. Is it a big deal? Is it something to be worried about? Is it something to be managed? Should our budget always be in balance? And by the way, when I'm talking about fiscal policy here, I'm talking about at the federal level. Which is why I mentioned specifically Congress and the president. Yes, I know that all states have their own fiscal policies, as do counties and cities and whatnot. But we're not interested in them so much, even though G, that big G that we have talked about, C plus I plus G, does include state and local spending, which is actually a larger amount than the federal government takes in. They don't really form policy that has a macroeconomic effect, throughout the entire economy. I can't think of any state that would have an outsized influence that would throw the entire economy in one direction or another. A $21 trillion economy, I can't imagine any single state could do that, even the largest like California or big states like California, Texas, and whatnot. Okay, so we are talking about federal budget policy. So when it comes to the budget philosophies, that is, and I use the term philosophy a little bit loosely here because it does reflect the fact that there are differing sort of viewpoints as to how to maintain a budget and whatnot. So, but there is something called the annually balanced budget, and it is what's known as what's called pro-cyclical, in the sense that it can amplify the budget either up or down based upon the business cycle. And there's a discussion in your text that I encourage you to read that talks about automatic stabilizers, which sort of works against this idea of the pro-cyclical nature of the economy. And without going into a lot of detail, because I think the text is relatively straightforward on this, what an automatic stabilizer does is basically take advantage of current tax rates. And when the economy is going great guns, businesses and individuals are making a lot of money. As a result, they're climbing into higher tax rates. And as a result, that extra taxation actually depresses demand and brings the economy back down to earth a bit. And so it keeps the economy from overinflating. It's sort of built into the system, which is why it's called an automatic stabilizer. And on the downside, when the economy is performing poorly, individuals and businesses are making less money. They fall into lower tax brackets or no bracket at all, thereby increasing the amount of money that they have to spend otherwise that would have gone to government, thereby bringing the economy back up to, or helping to support the economy its way back up to full employment. And those are the automatic stabilizers. And so when we talk about an annually balanced budget, though, one of the concerns about having an annually balanced budget is the fact that it may be what's called pro-cyclical, and that is it may exacerbate the business cycle as a result of that. So just as how that might work, it works something like this. And it's an argument against a sort of, what's the word? Sort of a knee-jerk reaction against deficits in general that, where people would say, hey, you shouldn't have any kind of budget deficit ever, ever, ever. This basically argues that, yes, you can have deficits and surpluses from time to time. And so let's talk about what that annually balanced budget might look like from a cyclical standpoint. And so what's going on here is essentially this. When we talk about an annually balanced budget, that is where the rule is that the budget has to be balanced on an annualized basis, then it can become a problem for the economy. And we're going to go through two scenarios here, and it's really the second scenario that's more problematic. And that's why some believe that a budget surplus or deficit is okay, and that just strictly adhering to this idea of a balanced budget is not necessarily a bad thing. So anyway, what about during the expansion? I think I'm running out of ink here. In other words, expansion is characterized by a rise in GDP. And so if there's a rise in GDP, then what is that necessarily relating to then? Well, it's going to relate to an increase in consumption and investment spending. That is household and business spending, which together essentially is what? It's an increase in aggregate demand, right? So aggregate demand is rising. And as a result of aggregate demand rising, the economy is growing. And so it means that taxes are going up. And because of the fact that the economy is going great guns, the government is spending actually less, particularly on these transfer type relief kind of payments. Not all transfers are in the form of welfare or unemployment or food assistance or whatever, but they are a fairly significant component of additional spending during downturns and reduced spending during upturns. And so during expansion, when the economy is going great guns and everyone's working and there's lots of spending going on, then the government's also raising more taxes and is spending less because it's spending less on unemployment and on all those sorts of things. In other words, the private sector is doing more of the heavy lifting in order to get the economy to full employment, okay? So if you were to say, okay, well, as a result of this would create a surplus. And so there has to be a response to this if you believe that, excuse me, the objective should be to have a balanced budget. And so as a result, what would the government do in this particular case? Well, it would counter these issues here, raising taxes in particular, and then cutting government spending. And I realize that it's easy for me to look at to be at a whiteboard and say, oh, the government just simply needs to raise taxes or cut government spending. When I realize that these are political decisions, they're not often easy, particularly raising taxes. But nonetheless, it does, it can happen. It certainly can happen in this particular situation. So what happens though when this does happen? Well, actually what this ends up doing then, by doing this particular sort of policy response, what is the government actually doing? It's actually getting an increase in aggregate demand going again, and as a result, it actually ends up increasing GDP. Okay, so let's move on to the second topic here and talk about how that is important. Oops, I made a mistake here. I realized this and I just now fixed it. It's actually cutting taxes and raising government spending, which creates the boost to aggregate demand and thereby boosts the economy still further. So in other words, you get sort of a double kick to GDP. And I think I'm about done with this black ink here. Hopefully everyone can see it. So now you might think, okay, well, what's the big deal there? What is the issue? Well, it's a bit of a difficult situation when you have a recession. So let's talk about what that condition would be. In other words, a recession is noted by a decrease in GDP, which, from the private sector standpoint, household and consumer spending are both falling, meaning aggregate demand is falling, meaning the government's getting less in tax revenue and is forced to spend more in terms of government spending. And so as a result, the economy is moving into a deficit, right? Now, if you were to say, okay, well, we have to have a balanced budget. So what is the policy response then? Because the balanced budget motivation is oftentimes thought to sort of outweigh other considerations, and such as getting to full employment, if you believe it. And so there is a fallacy that most economists are pointing to here about the balanced budget, where the budget has to be balanced every single year. So what's the policy response? Is simply to reverse this and raise taxes and cut government spending. But what that does is actually drives down GDP, which actually drives drives down aggregate demand and drives GDP down still further. So what is happening is it's making a bad situation worse. And it's this scenario here that was precisely one of the causes for the Great Depression that began with really a financial collapse in 1929, and that sort of got out of control throughout the late 20s and early 30s because the government was really concerned about trying to maintain an annually balanced budget and decided, hey, the thing we have to do is keep the budget in balance. There were some other things as well. It was not just on the fiscal policy side, which is what we're talking about here. There were also some monetary policy issues as well. So it was really a combination of a lot of things, including the fact that the US dollar was considered now the world's reserve currency and backed by gold, and the government didn't want to risk that status. And so as a result, running a deficit was thought to have been a bad idea, but it made a bad situation worse. And so the economy went from recession into full-blown depression. Here, it's just the opposite condition where the economy is going great guns. If you want to maintain a balanced budget, you'll do the kinds of things to bring the budget into balance, but it actually pours water on the fire, leading to excessive growth in GDP, which can be inflationary. So we go back to this thing that we talked about earlier, the idea that there are two essentially major macro problems that the economy is, that, well, the policymakers of the economy are trying to prevent against. It's inflation on the one hand and recession on the other hand, or recession and unemployment. So inflation on the one hand, recession and unemployment on the other hand. And as a result of these, simply keeping the emphasis on a balanced budget at the expense of all else is problematic. And so as a result, and I think we sort of touched on this a bit during in the discussion, because one of the things, and some of you had mentioned that, was that if the government was trying to simply balance the budget every year, it wouldn't have the ability to keep on spending, which is what it would have done anyway. Keep in mind, T is going to go down automatically, right? Simply because of the fact that people are spending less and therefore earning less. Remember, spending is someone's spending is someone else's earnings. So people are spending less, people are earning less. If they're earning less, they're paying less in taxes. And if they're paying less in taxes, the government's got fewer resources, while it's being asked to support the economy more in terms of government spending, relief payments for things like social unemployment benefits. I almost said Social Security. Forget I said that. Unemployment benefits, food assistance, housing assistance, increased spending on Medicaid. Those kinds of expenditures that therefore create deficits. But deficit spending is precisely what's needed in order to get out of an economic downturn. And this is exactly what the government has been doing the last couple of years as we've gotten sort of mired in a bit of a recession, an unusual recession caused by the pandemic that we're still in. Unfortunately, we're still trying to climb out of. But the government's gone very much into deficit, and that doesn't look like that's going to stop anytime soon. Okay, so that's the annually balanced budget. That is, what if taxation equals T equals G every year? The problem is it amplifies the business cycle, both from an inflationary standpoint and a recessionary standpoint, depending upon where in the business cycle it is. And so maintaining this focus on a balanced budget at the expense of all else is problematic. There is something called the cyclically balanced budget. And this is not to be confused with the cyclically adjusted budget that's discussed in your text, although it does derive itself from the same idea. But that is basically saying that with a cyclically balanced budget, what the government can simply do is to run surpluses during good times and deficits during poor economic times, and that theoretically and hopefully you might get to a balanced budget because the surpluses, which are basically a plus to the national debt and deficits, should cancel themselves out. So there should be theoretically no additions or subtractions from the national debt because they'll cancel themselves out as the economy swings back and forth. The problem with that is that we have seen much longer expansions over the years than we have recessions, which is a good thing. And unfortunately, the other problem with that is the fact that when there are surpluses being run, the government doesn't always respond by cutting government spending. In fact, it may actually increase government spending. One of the difficulties, and this is some of the concern about fiscal policy in general, is the fact that the motivations for spending may have nothing to do with economic reasons whatsoever, and yet they may have economic consequences. And so there was a lot of criticism among some economists over the government's actions during the 1960s when the government was spending money on things like the Vietnam War, which was expensive. And without debating the merits of whether the war was a good idea or a bad idea, there's no question about the fact that it cost a lot of money, lots of resources, in addition to lives and other sorts of things like that. But it was an expensive thing. But not only that, it was also the space program and a number of different government programs dealing with things like higher education, with housing, with criminal justice, the beginnings of the war on narcotics. All of these kinds of things were initiatives begun or ramped up in the 1960s. And that led to inflation in the 1970s, mostly because the economy was going great guns during this period, but the government did not lift off and actually increase government spending while it increased taxes. So this sounds very nice from a theoretical standpoint. Sometimes it doesn't always work in practice. It should, and sometimes it does, but it doesn't always. And sometimes government spends money on things that have nothing to do with economics whatsoever. And war is one of those in particular. And when wars are come about, they definitely have economic consequences, no question about it. Okay, and then the third of these that we talk about in the slide package here is something called functional finance, where basically the idea is that deficits and surpluses don't matter, in that the goal should be non-inflationary full employment. This is, even though this sounds, I mean, when an economist or a policymaker says something doesn't matter, something as big as a budget deficit or budget surpluses, they don't matter. It sounds like that's a sort of an outrageous statement, but the idea is not particularly radical. That's the idea that the thing that should be striven for is non-inflationary full employment. In other words, maximum employment with maximum price stability. That is the objective. And I think probably any macro textbook or any macroeconomist you would ever come across, if you were to ask the question, what is the goal of macro policy? It's to achieve, from a macro perspective, non-inflationary full employment. In other words, maximum employment with a maximum price stability, which is not to say zero inflation. It's not to say zero unemployment, because I think we made the case last time that there's always going to be some inflation. There's always going to be some unemployment. And the unemployment thing, nobody can ever figure out how to get that down to zero, even though among the programs in the 1960s that I mentioned were anti-poverty programs, which actually did lower the poverty rate, but then it sort of stopped. And we got from about 20% unemployment, which seems almost impossible to believe that 1/5 of households around 1960 were living in poverty. And there's some specific definitions as to how poverty is measured. And it brought it down to about 1 in 8 by the end of that decade. And there hasn't been much improvement since then. But those were expensive programs. And you could say, well, the government lifted off the gas, which is why the poverty rate hasn't fallen below that. But nonetheless, these are all political debates. These are all questions that are controversial and require the public to sort of weigh in. Okay, so I do want to talk about this idea of taxation principles, and this also is sort of a philosophical bit of discussion here that your book doesn't really get into, but I wanted to sort of talk about who is to pay tax, because obviously one half of the equation here is taxation, the other half being government spending. And we just spent several minutes talking about government spending, government priorities. Why would government do this and do that? And it could be for all kinds of different reasons. But when it comes to taxation, the question is, who is to pay the tax? And this is a never-ending debate. It's probably been going on for thousands of years since taxation first began as to whether or not tax is fair. Why should I pay this tax versus this person? Why shouldn't companies be paying more in tax? It's a never-ending debate. It's a never-ending debate. And so let's talk a bit about it. And some of these sort of dovetail with the ideas that we talked about previously, with the idea of things sounding good, but maybe not. Just like the idea of a balanced budget every year sounds good. And in fact, a lot of you have commented in the discussions that, hey, a balanced budget sounds good, that households balance their budgets, and so should government. However, let me just say one thing about that. I didn't mention this, I don't believe. The households really don't balance their budgets based upon the same math that the government uses. If in fact a household has any debt whatsoever, that's not balancing the budget of inflows versus outflows. And I'm not at all making a criticism of debt. I mean, people couldn't go to college without debt usually, couldn't buy a house, couldn't buy a car. There are lots of positive contributors that borrowing has. We're certainly going to get into that when we talk about monetary policy. But I'm simply saying by the same calculation that people use, and politicians love to talk about this, the idea of, hey, households balance their budget, why shouldn't government? Well, households really don't balance their budget based upon the same mathematics that the government uses. And so we should sort of take a bit of a break here in acknowledging the fact that households really do not, if they have any amount of debt at all, and most households do. Okay, so back to the idea of who pays taxes, who should pay taxes. There is one concept known as the benefit principle, and that goes like this. And then this kind of sounds a bit like, I sort of link this back to the annually balanced budget based upon the idea of a shiny object that sounds really good. At first glance, it might sound like, or first look, it might sound like a great idea. Once you start getting into the details, it's not so great. The benefit principle goes like this, that those who get the most benefit from taxes those who get the most benefit from government should pay the most in taxes. So that is, if I get no benefit whatsoever, then I shouldn't have to pay as much. And if somebody else gets more benefit, then they should have to pay for it. The problem with that is the making that work is simply absolutely impossible. And it works its way. And yet that's an argument that people make at all levels of taxation, including at the local level, where people will say, I'm not going to pay my property taxes because property taxes are primarily used to fund public schools. I paid for public schools when my kids were younger. I no longer have kids in public school. I'm not paying my property tax. Well, we know it doesn't work that way. Or there was a movement during the Vietnam War for people not paying their taxes because they didn't want to pay for a war that they didn't believe in. Well, it doesn't work that way. You don't get to pick and choose what taxes you pay based upon the fact that you may not personally benefit from what you think is either a good idea or a bad idea that you're not simply willing to pay for it. It just doesn't work. And so the idea of a benefit principle doesn't happen to make sense. Also, if you consider the fact that there are a lot of spending is for those who need, and if you're talking about unemployment benefits or any kind of income support type systems, food assistance, housing assistance, who are you trying to tax? The very people that need the assistance in the first place. And so you're trying to tax those who can't pay the tax. If they could pay the tax they would have, they wouldn't need the government spending in the first place. So operationally, it doesn't really make very much sense in order to make that happen. Plus, it opens up all these doors to people not wanting to pay tax because they fundamentally disagree with what government's doing with the money in the first place. And while we can disagree with what the government is doing with the money, it still doesn't make any difference because taxes are one of the very few economic events that are compulsory. Everywhere else in the circular flow model, whether it's consumer spending, investment spending, imports, exports, all that, even government spending, those are all pretty much optional and discretionary. You can choose to do it or not, or choose not to do it. You can choose to withhold your labor or not. You can choose to buy a good or not buy a good. But taxes, you don't really have that option. It just simply doesn't exist. And there have been myriad efforts on the part of people to say taxes are unconstitutional, I'm not going to pay them, and I don't get any benefit from them anyway because I live in a cabin in the middle of the woods, I don't even have electricity. Nice try, it's not going to work. That sort of argument is a non-starter. Okay, so that's a difficult one. So instead, the one that's relied upon is maybe less equitable sounding, but it's the most operationally rational, and that's something called the ability to pay principle. The ability to pay principle goes like this. Those who have the most ability to pay should pay the most in taxes. So those who earn more should pay more in taxes, including corporations. And as a result, that is essentially the logic behind our income tax system. It may not apply to things like taxes on goods, which tend to work in the opposite direction from a percentage of income standpoint. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But when we talk about something called the progressive tax system, what we're talking about is simply tax brackets. And let's get into that just a bit here and talk about what the progressive tax system is, because it may help to clarify a bit what's going on with this idea of automatic stabilizers, which I don't really get into a lot in this course, mostly because some of it is a bit more detailed than what I think is important in a 200 level class. But when we talk about a progressive tax system, what we're really getting at here is the idea of tax brackets. And we're talking about a progressive income tax system is what we're really getting into here. And that is the idea that if you have personal income, and let's just take this from an individual level. I realize that the tax code is very much more complicated than what I'm even going to be laying out here, including there's a corporate tax, there's a state tax, there's taxation of trusts and partnerships and all that. I realize that. I understand that. And I am simply saying that I'm aware of that, but I'm just trying to simplify here just in order to make this make a little bit more sense. And so the marginal tax rate is simply a percentage of, in this case, personal income. So let's say, that, and I realize also that when we talk about individual taxes, there are 5 filing statuses: single, married filing joint, head of house, all that. I understand that too. Let's just focus on, say, married filing joint, right? And I'm just going to make up numbers here and say that if your income is between 0 and say 15,000, these aren't the actual dollar figures. I realize that tax laws do change, that you might pay something like 10% as a marginal tax rate. If you make somewhere between $15,001 and say 25,000, it might go to 15%, meaning that the first 15,000 is taxed at 10%, the next 10,000 is taxed at 15%. That's what makes it marginal. Marginal, everywhere in economics, when you hear the term marginal, we're talking incremental. That is, it steps up or down depending upon which direction we're going. In this case, we're going up. And so if you're talking about this particular bracket, it's going up. So between 25,001 and let's say 45,000. Again, I'm making these numbers up. It doesn't really make any difference here. And then maybe it's, let's say, above 45, greater than equal, or let's say greater than 45,000. And I realize these are not the actual numbers. It goes to 30%. So in other words, what's going on? What's going on is as income goes up, the marginal tax rate goes up. And this is the ability to pay principle is manifest in the progressive tax system. As people earn more, they pay more, not just in dollar figures. They would pay more in dollar figures, even if the tax rate were flat. That is constant. That's a flat tax, which is periodically discussed in the political realm, is simply a tax rate that's the same for everybody. We've had presidential candidates, Steve Forbes, Herman Cain. Herman Cain in particular talked about a 9.99 tax rate that actually was fairly popular with a lot of people. He was the front runner for the Republican nomination in 2016 before Donald Trump sort of surged ahead and took that nomination away. But Herman Cain did get a lot of publicity for saying, let's have one rate and same rate for everybody, whether you're LeBron James making gazillions of dollars a year, or whether you're somebody who works at a minimum wage occupation. The same rate should apply, and make it simple so that you can't avoid tax and all that. Well, that's not the way it really works. And in fact, if in fact that were to happen, and there's a reason why it's not going to happen, because the high earners, let's say we settle in somewhere in the middle, let's say 17% is a flat tax. Well, it means the high earners who are flying high, and 45,000 is not exactly wealthy, I understand that. But then we get a tax cut, and the people earning minimum wage, we get a tax increase. And there are a lot more people on the lower end of the income distribution than on the upper end. And politically, that is very difficult. In fact, that's a non-starter. That's simply not going to happen. And we hear story after story in the press about who pays income tax, who doesn't pay income tax. And sometimes these articles are not really even that clear as to what's going on and how the press even knows that, because tax return information is not exactly public information. Anyone's taxes, not even corporations. In fact, if you look at business financial statements that are public, they are trying to be as opaque as possible regarding tax issues. They'll disclose as much as they can, but they don't include tax returns. So you kind of get the idea. The flat tax is probably a non-starter. The progressive tax system is much more applicable because it's easier to tax those who earn more than those who earn less. which is what the benefit principle would suggest, that is, tax these people more than these people, which is politically not particularly possible. Okay, so this is the form of system that we use to raise taxes at the federal level. And some states, New Mexico is one state that has a marginal tax system that is progressive, meaning it goes up with income. Some states have more of a flat tax, but some others do not. And some states have no state income tax whatsoever. And in those particular cases, it sounds like a great idea, and it's a great idea if you're a big earner, because how the government, and the government's got to raise, state government's got to raise its money somehow. So states like Texas and Florida, Nevada, they raise it through a lot of other taxes, like taxes on goods, which can tend to be very regressive, because if you're a low income earner, you're going to spend, remember what we say about lower income households, they spend more of their income than do higher income households. And so as a percentage of income, if people are spending money on goods that are subject to tax, like gasoline and cigarettes and whatnot, then it means that they're paying more as a percentage of income than our higher income earners, who are taking some of their income and channeling it toward savings. And savings are not taxed. The earnings on savings can be taxed, but not savings themselves, and like consumption is. And so in many ways, taxes on goods are considered to be regressive. And that's in itself sort of problematic, because there are a lot of goods that are subject to tax just because of the nature of the good itself, where it's considered to be low-hanging fruit to state governments in particular. Things like gasoline, people have got to buy gasoline. So as a result, you pay a combination of federal and state tax on that. Cigarettes, which are an addictive substance. In fact, all tobacco products are taxed heavily. And as a result, smokers pay a lot of tax, a lot of goods tax, not an income tax at all. In fact, you're taxed on your income, and then you get taxed on those same dollars again if you buy cigarettes or gasoline. And most of us do buy gasoline, and so as a result, that's our regressive tax, because in fact, if you consider the fact that a lot of very high income people don't drive very much, because a lot of them are retired or simply don't drive that much, don't drive to work an hour one way or anything like that, then you can see that that's even more regressive, the tax on gasoline. So our regressive tax goes the opposite direction, where the more you earn, the less you pay percentage-wise of your income. And a progressive tax goes the other direction. So our entire system of income tax, which is really what we're talking about, we talk about T versus G. That T is based on income tax, and is based on really a progressive tax system. That is the idea of raising income tax from those who earn, and really not taxing those who don't earn. And by the way, there are a lot of people who don't pay very much in income tax, simply, and not because they are trying to fly under the radar and evade taxes. They simply don't owe tax because their incomes aren't high enough to pay tax. In fact, if anything, they may get a refund through what's called a refundable tax, notably the earned income tax credit, which is a negative tax that was started about 50 years ago or so as a way to, what started as a temporary measure to relieve a recession around 73, I believe, 73, 74, but it has become a permanent feature of our tax code, the earned income credit, which is a negative tax that it really, and in fact, the income thresholds are not as low as what you might expect. And it's indexed based upon income, as well as number of dependent children primarily. And then part of the child tax credit is also a negative tax. And by negative tax or refundable tax, all I'm simply saying is it would pay you money back even over and above what you ever paid in withholding, which you would get back too if you had zero tax liability. Any amount that you paid in withholding, you would get back, and you wouldn't be eligible to pay tax, and nor would you. And that's perfectly legal. It's part of the design, and it's part of the stimulus program that is always in place. It's part of the built-in stabilizer, that is to prevent those who are of lower earners from falling off into more serious poverty. Okay. All right. So the next step here is to talk about policy, fiscal policy, as a means of trying to boost the economy or to slow down the economy. And we will get to that here in just a second. Okay. So one of the interesting things about doing a recording is that it gives me a chance to sort of prepare some of this in my own time. So I want to talk about the two forms of policy that are used as stabilization policy. When we talk about government policy, what we're really talking about stabilization, that is to try to keep the economy in between, somewhere between full, so we avoid unemployment on the one hand, inflation on the other, in order to maintain non-inflationary full employment. In other words, maximum employment with maximum price stability. And so in the case of expansionary fiscal policy, it's done in the case of trying to manage this, a downturn in the economy, which is due to a shift in aggregate demand to the left from AD0 to AD1, and thereby bringing GDP down from full employment GDP, that is the GDP that is associated with full employment, where there is now cyclical unemployment, right? Full employment is a condition where there's zero cyclical unemployment. The only unemployment there is this naturally occurring incidental unemployment of frictional and structural, where it's going to happen, but it's not due to the economy being bad. And so in this case, we're saying the economy is bad, so something is happening where aggregate demand has fallen, and so now we've got a decline in GDP due to the fact of the decline in aggregate demand. So what does the government do in this case? It does a combination of things, lowers taxes or raises government spending, or both, some combination of both. And that or both part of this is oftentimes what tends to happen, is the or both happens. Before we get into that, I want to revisit the multiplier though real quickly and talk about what the multiplier is. Now, you might recall from our previous discussion where we talked about the only multiplier we had really talked about up to this point was what's called the multiplier on consumption. And that is the multiplier on consumption takes the reciprocal of the savings rate of some change in disposable income, how much of that will get saved, how much of it will get spent. In other words, what percentage of that percentage that gets saved and not spent, the reciprocal of that is the multiplier. And in other words, and the multiplier, and because MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, which is a percentage, plus the marginal propensity to save, must equal 100%, those percentages must add up to one another. And so another way of saying MPS is simply 1 minus MPC. It's the same relationship, it's just a different way of stating it, simply because of the fact that MPC plus MPS must equal 1. And the big thing for us to know here is the fact that the multiplier does what? It magnifies some initial change in the economy. The only one we really talked about last time was the multiplier on consumption, where we said, okay, if there's a change in disposable income for whatever reason, how much will that translate to a change in GDP because of the fact that some of it's going to go to consumption? And we said that it doesn't just stop, it's not like throwing a rock into a pond and the pond goes, and there's no ripple. Instead, it ripples, like what happens when you throw a rock into a still lake. It ripples out, so it's not just one transaction, it becomes subsequent transactions. Somebody's given a stimulus check, for instance, which adds to their disposable income. That sounds familiar. That's been happening the last couple of years. People have spent that. Now, as they've spent that, it's created demand that wouldn't have been there otherwise. That creates, therefore, the sellers of those goods have to restock those goods and have to make more orders on their own. And all that supply chain going backwards then to the manufacturer, people are being employed more than they would have been otherwise. And as a result, it's this ripple effect. And it is some factor that is simply the reciprocal of the savings rate. So what doesn't get saved gets spent, and it is magnified by that and becomes the multiplier. And so in this case, let's just take an example and say, if the marginal propensity to save were 80%, then 1 over that would give us what? A multiplier of 5, right? Oh, I'm sorry, if it were 20%, 1 over that would be, in other words, the marginal propensity to consume were 0.8, the marginal propensity to save, therefore, would be 0.2. And so 1 divided by 0.2 is 5, meaning that some change in the economy is going to have a 5-fold increase in the economy as a result. So if the multiplier were 5, right, then some change in aggregate demand is going to lead to a change in GDP. And by the way, this can be up or down. That's one of the things that I think is important to talk about, is the sense that it's not just an increase, it's also a decrease. In both aggregate demand and GDP, both of those are, it's important for us to know that both of those can work in both directions, okay, depending upon what the objective is, okay? So in this case, let's say we've got a recession happening because something happened in the economy where there's a fall off in aggregate demand, maybe business confidence is waning, maybe people are less confident and whatnot, or whatever the recovery is running out of steam. So aggregate demand has fallen. And we have plotted the price level here in our aggregate demand or in our macro model against real GDP. So whenever we talk about Y, now we're talking about real or inflation adjusted GDP. Okay. Aggregate supply upward sloping in the short run. We will get to the long run derivation of that next time, but something has happened where there's a fall off. Now, a couple of things. We have a new equilibrium point, right? So equilibrium GDP was at full employment. Now it's something less than full employment. Meaning the distance between this and this, that interval there along the GDP axis is known as the output gap. In this case, a recessionary gap where actual GDP is less than the full employment GDP. In other words, the full employment GDP that will result in no cyclical unemployment, only the frictional and structural variety of unemployment. And let's just say that gap is $200 billion, okay? So the economy needs $200 billion in new output in order to get to full employment. So what would need to happen in this case? Well, it doesn't need $200 billion in new aggregate demand. It just needs something different. Let's say the multiplier throughout the entire economy for all aggregate demand items is 5. Then all that needs to happen is some change. We'll just have that as a dotted line here. Some change here, we'll call it AD prime. And let's say that change here is only going to be $40 billion. So the change in aggregate demand is 40 billion because the multiplier 5 times 40 billion equals the 200 billion that will close the gap. So the multiplier times the change in aggregate demand, which is this formula here, results in the change in GDP. And both of these are positive. In other words, to move rightward on this axis in order to push the economy to full employment. Notice that we didn't have to go all the way to $200 billion. We didn't just create, because had we done that, we would have ended up with $1 trillion in new spending, and that would have pushed us beyond full employment, not where we wanted to go. That's going to be the next scenario that we'll talk about here in a second. Now, notice that there's another equilibrium point that appears to be missing, and that is, hey, what did you do at price level? Because here aggregate demand has fallen, so shouldn't the price level fall? Well, and I kind of got into this a bit last time, and I wanted to sort of defer this a bit until we got into this discussion. There is a substantial amount of observational, that is empirical evidence that prices don't usually tend to fall in our economy. That is, they tend not to go down, but they tend to be what's called downwardly inflexible, also known as the ratchet effect. A ratchet is simply a tool that goes one direction, is locked out from going the other direction. And what we're simply saying is that that aggregate demand may fall, bringing GDP down, but the price level tends not to fall. And we know this from our own experiences. There has only been really one instance of deflation in our lifetimes, assuming that you weren't around in the 1930s, and I don't know that that's the case, but the 1930s were the last instance of true deflation. And it was about a year, about 2009, it was a deflationary year, mostly brought on by just extreme falls, drop off in aggregate demand. And but that's the only time. Our economy really doesn't do that for a lot of different reasons. Some of those are due to the fact that, and there's a lot of theory that's bound up in this. Some of the theory says that, well, it's because workers don't want to take wage decreases. They'd rather be laid off than take wage cuts. Or if it's a situation of layoffs, that some workers who have seniority would prefer that the employers lay off newer people than lay off or give everyone else a wage cut. A wage cut would translate to a form of price cut as a result. And so there's that. So this goes back to something that's first talked about, and I also sort of said I would revisit a bit later when we talked about chapter 6 in the text, where I said it's a chapter that you might want to kind of skim. We're going to be coming back to some of it. And one of those came back to this idea of price stickiness. And if you're reading chapter 6, you're like, what the heck is price stickiness? Well, it has to do with this idea. By sticky, I mean it doesn't flex, it doesn't move. It's sort of stuck in place, sort of stuck in gear. Now it can go up, and we know that the price level can go up. but it usually doesn't go down. And so for this region here, for those of you who've taken micro before, which I think probably not many have, but that shaded region will be called what we call a deadweight loss. And that is, a deadweight loss is simply a black hole in the economy, just sort of a vacuum where there's no value. We've lost GDP, but we're not really getting the benefit of a price decrease, simply because of the fact that our price structure doesn't tend to go down for a lot of different reasons. Firms don't want to lower prices. Workers don't want to take lower wages. Firms would rather lose sales, and workers would rather lose jobs, or have others lose their jobs as a result. And when I say workers don't mind losing jobs, I realize it sounds like a really ridiculous statement, but it's part of the idea behind this idea of the ratchet effect, and that is the fact that workers don't like to take wage decreases for obvious reasons. And that even if offered to 2,000 workers at a plant, if you all take a 20% wage cut, we can save jobs, or we can let 500 of you go. The other 1,500 would favor that. And I think that is a lot of evidence to suggest that, particularly in a non-union shop. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that behavior would happen. Okay, so again, it's only 40 billion of stimulus going this direction in order to push the economy forward. And that dotted line is just simply, think about it as just being the jump start, the kickstart that moves the economy back to full employment, so that at 80-0, which is the starting point, we return back to, and we get back to a condition of full employment while not doing anything at all to the price level, that is the price remaining fixed in place. Okay, so that is part of the logic of what an expansionary fiscal policy would look like. Now let's take a look at what would happen in the case of a contractionary policy. Okay, and to talk about contractionary fiscal policy, it's just the opposite of the condition of expansionary policy, where if expansionary policy was meant to control unemployment and recession, then contractionary policy is the opposite part of the business cycle, where the economy is growing too quickly, and so there's and it's becoming inflationary, which is noticed by an increase in the price level. Prices go up, they tend not to go down, but the price level tends to go up. And remember, the P in the macro model is the price level, based upon some price index, such as the CPI or the GDP deflator. It's usually the CPI is a pretty good one. It's one that is used often, and we talked about that in the last video. It's just simply a way of measuring the price level changes throughout the economy. So what's happening in this scenario is the government there's been an increase in spending potentially. And this is what we would typically refer to as what's called demand pull inflation. Excuse me. I'm going to get into more of this in the discussion of chapter 18 when we talk more about demand pull inflation versus cost push. This is the most traditional kind of inflation. That is excessive aggregate demand. Talked a bit about that last time in saying that the very generic definition of it is too much demand, too much money chasing too few goods. As a result, yes, the economy does grow. And in fact, suppliers will slide up their supply curve in order to take advantage of those higher prices, and will supply more output as a result, which grows GDP, but it also grows the price level. And so as a result, remember, the objective of macro policy is to achieve non-inflationary full employment. So to remove the inflation, what will the government do? A combination of raising taxes, lowering government spending, or both. The both tends to be what tends to happen. In the scenario I just talked about with expansionary policy, I just got into the government policy, or the government spending piece of it, because that translates closer to aggregate demand, which is what we're really shooting for there. But it's the very same idea of, you could also increase taxes, although multiplier is different, because if you increase taxes, remember, it's got to go through that. Some of that's, some of the disposable income is saved and some is not. So that's an issue, particularly on the expansionary side. If you cut taxes, then some of that's going to go towards saving and not to spending. So that weakens the multiplier. Okay. But let's just say the multiplier for the entire economy is 5. Okay. Same condition we talked about before. And the inflationary gap is the same 200 billion as before. So same dollar figure here, $200 billion. Then what needs to happen is simply a reduction in aggregate demand by probably cutting government spending or raising taxes or both. In other words, the change in aggregate demand here is to the negative, and it's a negative $40 billion. which then lowers GDP by $200 billion, because remember, it's the multiplier times the change in aggregate demand, which in this case is negative 40 billion, which gives us then a decrease in GDP of negative 200 billion. So bringing GDP down is the objective here in order to squeeze inflation out of the system. Notice one other thing too is the fact that, again, we're not modeling a decrease in the price level. We're simply saying that prices remain elevated, but they don't fall back again. And this is, by the way, we've heard a lot about this in the last few months as inflation has begun to kick in. And that is the idea, and we've heard a lot of economists talk about this ratchet effect and how it's becoming more and more proven. Even as the economy has slipped off into recession, we haven't seen prices go down. If anything, we've seen prices go up, and which is why we've had an inflationary bit of an inflationary condition of late. So, you know, the ratchet effect does appear to work, and you get the idea that prices tend not to go down, which is not to say, and I think I mentioned this last time, that prices on some goods don't go down. And the ones that come to mind are goods of a tech nature, newly introduced goods that start out at very high prices and go down over time. I mean, I know I bought my first personal computer some 30 years ago and paid like $2,000 in money 30 years ago, which would be something like, I think I spent like $2,000, which would be something like $4,000 today for a computer that had, I think, 120 meg or something like that, and a very slow processor. Yes, those prices have come down. That's got more to do with cost of production than it does with general macro price level. That, as these firms are producing more and more, it costs them less to produce. It doesn't cost Dell Computer very much to make a computer at all. They've got so much inventory and their scale is so large, it just doesn't cost them very much to make. And that's why you can buy a very nice, very powerful computer for a few $100s. And today, I don't even know that there's much of a business for a computer repair like there once was, simply because of the fact that they're almost like TVs in the sense that I don't even know anybody who's a TV repairman, because if your TV wears out, usually you just go get another one. And that's similar to what's going on with computers. And so those goods will go down in price, not having to do with any kind of reverse ratchet effect. So we're not saying that that downward inflexibility is negated because of the falling prices of some goods like TVs and computers, but because of the fact that cost of production goes down as these firms scale up, as the volume of that particular business rises. Okay, so that's contractionary fiscal policy. That's the other side of the coin here. That's the other part of stabilization policy that is made up of fiscal policy. Now, next time we're going to get into, on Thursday, we'll talk about this idea of expansionary and contractionary monetary policy. Remember, there are two forms of government stabilization policy, fiscal and monetary. We've only focused on fiscal tonight. We'll get to monetary a bit later, but it'll have very much the same effect, using the same multipliers, but involving different variables. And they involve different variables because there are different objectives and different actors involved and different speeds of these things happening. Okay. All right. So I just want to quickly go through some of the rest of the material in the slide package here. And then I want to get into some of the timing issues because I think that's an important thing for us to get into. So I talked a bit about this idea of the deficit, that when we have a condition in which where taxation does not equal government spending, and in this case, where taxation is less than government spending, then we have a deficit. And I want to differentiate the term deficit, which is annual shortfall, and these are measured in annual terms. A lot of these are measured in annual terms, like GDP is an annual figure. Even though it's reported quarterly, it's an annualized figure. Taxes run on an annual basis, government spending on an annual basis. The deficit's an annualized figure. But it differs in the sense that it differs from the national debt. The national debt is the accumulation of all the outstanding deficits which have never been paid off yet. Now, when we say paid off, that begs the question, what do you mean paid off? How do we get to not pay them off? And the main issue here is, how does government finance deficits? And that's really the subject of where we go next. And that is, how does a government take care of financing a shortfall on an annual basis? And the most obvious way is by engaging in saving, just like households would engage in saving. And the main means of financing this is through borrowing. This is why we talk about the difference between the deficit, which is the annual figure, and the national debt, which is the accumulation of all the borrowings that the federal government has made, excuse me, or any government, not just our government, the British government, the Russian government, whomever, has made over time that's still outstanding and is still on the books and has never been retired. I know that a lot of politicians will talk about, let's pay off the national debt at some point so that we don't hand it off to our grandchildren. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard this thing about grandchildren. Well, we're not, I mean, I guess we are, but we're not really. I mean, yes, we're still paying on World War II. The debt from that is still outstanding, but World War II cost a fraction of what the stimulus has, and we've incurred stimulus in the last 2 years, not just because of inflation that prices have changed between now and then, but the economy is bigger, and as a result, we've sort of outgrown some of that. Think about it this way, when we talk about the national debt, and here, it might make sense to link it back to households, even though I sort of don't like to this metaphor of talking about households and the federal budget, because I don't think it's a very good comparison. I just don't think the two are the same. And when we talk about monetary policy, they're really not the same because households have no way to create money. But for our purposes here, let's just talk about something like about borrowing in general and how much is too much. Because when we talk about questions of the national debt, there have been a lot of questions of the national debt is going to strangle us, or we're handing it off to our grandchildren to repay. And we sort of are, but we're sort of not. And think about this. There is debt that is useful, there's debt that's not useful. And so let's think about it. Somebody might borrow $2,000 to buy 2,000 lottery tickets. Maybe go take a cash advance on a MasterCard to buy 2,000 lottery tickets. That's probably, if the odds are the way the odds generally are, it's probably a bad investment. It's probably a bad way to manage one's finances, is to borrow money to buy lottery tickets. Probably not a very good thing to do. However, what if you borrowed even greater amount of money, like let's say you borrowed $200,000 to go to medical school? Well, then that's not so bad, and that's 100 times greater. But why is that different? Well, because there's an expected payoff from going to medical school, whereas if you become a medical doctor, $200,000 in debt, based on a medical doctor's salary of say $400,000 or $500,000 a year, if one is a specialist, isn't that big of a deal. So there is debt that it's a question of scale, and that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the national debt. Is when we talk about the debt from World War II, that's a fraction of the national debt, mostly because our economy has outgrown it. Remember, with inflation, those who benefit are borrowers because they're repaying in cheaper dollars. And so, yes, I guess I'm the grandchild. Well, I'm the son of a World War II veteran, and I guess my son is being passed on to him as the grandchild, but not really. I don't know that he's going to pay any more in taxes than what he would have otherwise as a result of our borrowing money to finance World War II, any more than my grandchildren will pay to finance the stimulus that we're engaging in right now in order to overcome the pandemic. So I think we've got to be a bit careful. Now, having said that, you can be in a situation where there's so much national debt that there is just simply nothing left in the budget in order to pay for anything else. The chapter 13 begins with a discussion of what's called discretionary versus non-discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is where policymakers, in this case, Congress and the president, can decide what are the priorities, what are we going to spend money on. We're going to build a rail system from coast to coast. Remember, the president has talked a lot about infrastructure and wanting to do those things, do a lot of these things. Some of that has made it through some legislative hurdles already. He's not going to get all he wants. I think he has a very long wish list, but some of it will probably get done. But it's a question of priorities as to how we choose those discretionary amounts of spending. But there are non-discretionary items, and among those are the interest on the national debt, which nobody believes is discretionary. Nobody would like to see the U.S. government default on its debt. It would be a major bit of trouble if the U.S. government ever did, and never has yet, except I know that the story that you hear in all textbooks is the U.S. has never defaulted on debt. Actually, it has. It defaulted on debt to the British. That was incurred prior to the revolution, but I don't know if that really counts because the U.S. wasn't really the U.S. So, and I think the U.S. might have stiffed the British on some debt around the War of 1812. I don't think that is that relevant to what we're talking about now. Okay, so borrowing money is really what's going on there. Now, there's a discussion in your book toward the very end of this chapter, something called crowding out. So one of the consequences that could be negative is something called crowding out. And that is the idea that the government running too big of a deficit and thereby borrowing too much money will actually prevent others from borrowing, particularly private borrowers. And the crowding out phenomenon is a bit more theoretical than it is empirical, that is observed, but it basically goes like this, that if we have a big pool of money, we're going to call the national savings, okay? So a giant pool of money. And we'll define this pool a little bit more concretely when we get to chapter 16 and talk about the money supply and all that. But let's say the government's borrowing money in order to finance its shortfall. So as a result, it starts to chip away at the national savings. In other words, the U.S. government is thought to have what's known as the first claim on the nation's savings. And that is the idea that if the government needs to borrow money, it will do so, and it will pay whatever interest rate it needs to pay in order to finance its spending, its shortfalls, in other words. And as I noted in one of the discussions, that there is no difficulty in our government borrowing money. It typically does it through the U.S. Treasury, which is really the fiscal arm of the executive branch, the U.S. Treasury, that issues debts pretty much on a weekly basis of different denominations, running from 90 days to 30 years, okay? And paying various different interest rates. Right now, the interest rates on Treasury debt are exceptionally low, which tells us that the world believes that the U.S. government is a pretty good credit risk. A 10-year note, 10-year bond that the federal government issues, I think they're paying 1.5%, which is well below the rate of inflation. In other words, the federal government is paying negative real interest rates in order to borrow money. So what does that tell you? That the government has no trouble borrowing money. So once again, we come back to this idea of maybe the deficit and debt aren't as big of a deal as what we're sort of led to believe. But the crowding out phenomenon asserts that just the opposite, that it is. In fact, if the government continues to chip away at the national savings by having that first claim, then there's less available for everybody else. And think about the issue of scarcity that we talked about long ago in the class. And that is, if something becomes more scarce, it goes up in price. And so the price of borrowed money becomes higher for private seekers of capital who are looking to buy houses and to expand inventory and do all those kinds of things. So that is a potential downside of government borrowing. Okay. There's also another form called money creation, or simply debt monetization, where the government could simply do this. It could borrow money to finance its shortfall, and it does it periodically through the treasury auctions. Anybody can buy it, including foreigners. And by the way, there's a graph on page 278, it looks like, in your book that talks about the U.S. debt. There's a big pie chart that talks about who owns the debt. And about half of it is owned by government entities, state and federal, mostly federal. I know there's a lot of talk about the fact that foreign buyers of our debt are strangling us and they could sink our economy. It's not an insignificant proportion of foreign holders of our debt, but a lot of it's foreign governments that are friendly to the U.S. and probably are unlikely to do it. And even those who are not quite as friendly, but maybe are a little bit adversarial, like the Chinese government, really have no desire to weaken the value of its holdings of our debt. And so as a result, the idea that that's a serious problem is a little bit overblown in many ways. But what does debt monetization refer to? It'd be simply the idea that we issue debt and then we simply print money to pay that debt off. That sounds a little bit far-fetched, but it does happen all the time. It has been happening quite a bit recently. The idea that the federal government can simply replace debt with money, and it has been doing it. In fact, the federal government's been doing a lot of that through the Federal Reserve, which is where we get the junction between fiscal and monetary policy. And there's something known as modern monetary theory, which, if you have heard anything about that, is simply a coordination between fiscal and monetary policy, which doesn't always exist. And over time, there's often been conflict between the two. But where it does exist, it can result in this idea of simply monetizing the debt, simply creating new money. And that, which is essentially what's happening. So yes, the government borrows more than it takes in, but unlike you and I, if we spend more than what we are earning, and we borrow, in other words, engaging in dis savings, the opposite of savings is borrowing. We don't have a printing press in our backyard and we can print more money. It'd be very nice if we could, but there's a reason why we don't. And so as a result, the government can do it because it's got that ability to do it. We'll talk a bit more about money and monetization of the debt a bit later. It could also increase taxes. The problem with that is, number one, it's politically problematic to raise taxes. Politicians have been punished for doing that. I'm thinking in particular of George H.W. Bush, the 41st president, who campaigned for office the first time he was elected by saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And he ended up signing off on a tax increase, which contributed toward his losing re-election. And I think a lot of people believe that had something to do with it, the sort of backtracking on his promise not to raise taxes, which turns out not to have been the reality. So that's difficult. It also has the effect of slowing down the economy, just like what would happen in a contractionary condition. And slowing down the economy, frankly, is oftentimes not considered to be palatable to elected officials. So that's deficit financing. What about surplus financing? Now, this is a little bit more theoretical because we haven't had to do it recently, but the first of these is debt reduction. That is, if the government is taking more in than what it's spending, then it must mean it's got extra money to do something with. And what it could do is to begin to pay off the national debt. And we've got a very substantial amount of national debt, about 20-some trillion dollars in national debt. It's been out there for a very long time. What if we began to whittle away at that? That would bring down the interest expense that the government pays. That's a non-discretionary budget item, unlike something like building new rail lines or having free daycare or whatever. All these initiatives. That's something that nobody's talking about backing off on is interest on the debt. So, but it would lower that if the debt were itself lower. So, that's one option. And by the way, some of that was done back in the late 90s, where some of the national debt was reduced as the economy was running surpluses. And in fact, and I don't think I mentioned this, I think somebody had made an interesting point during the discussions about what if we have a surplus and whatnot. And I thought one of the interesting things was that came to mind was the idea that in the late 90s, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time talked about this idea of what if we have surpluses that run off, for the foreseeable future, and then we pay off the national debt, then what does that do to our financial system? Because a lot of the pricing of money in general at all levels, credit cards, mortgages, student loans, is based upon a very base rate that goes along. It's called the risk-free rate of interest. It's based upon the treasury rate. Well, if there are no treasury debts out there because there's no treasury debt, there's no national debt, then what does that do? It was mere speculation because it didn't happen. The government turned the other direction and actually cut taxes, creating more deficits beginning around 2001. Okay, the surplus could be impounded. That is, the surplus could be simply put in an escrow account and brought out when it was needed. This is not so far-fetched. States do it all the time, including New Mexico. It's sometimes called rainy day funds, where surpluses are generated and they're simply set aside so they can be drawn upon during lean economic times, so as not to raise taxes in order to balance the budget. Because unlike the federal government, most states, including New Mexico, have it where they cannot run a deficit on a yearly basis. And sometimes it's written into the Constitution, the state cannot run a deficit. That's a bit problematic. And so this is why impounding happens with states that during boom years, when there's a lot of tax revenue coming in, they'll simply set that aside. And some states end up having hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in set-asides so that it can be withdrawn and put back into circulation during lean economic times when government is needed to support the local state economy and tax revenues aren't coming in because of incomes being leaner. Okay, so impounding does happen. And some economies are notorious for doing that, including not even counting as a surplus. The Japanese accounting system does that, certainly. And then the third is tax reduction, which was actually what was done in the late 90s, early 2000s. Taxes were cut And then what happened was we went back into to deficit and increases in national debt. Okay, and I want to talk a bit about timing issues or lags. This is one of the more important takeaways, I think, from the whole discussion of fiscal policy, particularly as it relates to something that is difficult to model here, and that is time frame, because nowhere on this graph are you seeing time being modeled. And it's a real shortcoming. I mean, I guess we could, if we had a way of making this a 3D model, sort of pushing through the board here, we could show over time how this goes down and this, brings down GDP and squeezes out inflationary increases, et cetera. But timing is difficult, particularly with regard to fiscal policy, and particularly with fiscal policy in relation to monetary policy, which we'll get to shortly. And among those are a number of lags that are what we would call cumulative. That is, one lag then builds into the second lag, which builds into the third lag. And so as a result, we have these lags become a continuation of a time delay. And by lag, we simply mean that there is a delay. There's a delay. So the first of these is known as the recognition lag. And this is not, and by the way, these are not intended as criticisms of elected officials. I know sometimes people interpret these as being such, but that's not really so much the case. They're simply the reality of what the democratic process is all about. And among these is really no reflection at all on policymakers. It's simply a recognition that sometimes takes a while to recognize what's going on. Is there inflation happening? Is there a recession? Are we in a recession? By the way, being in a recession, oftentimes you don't know when you're in a recession until months after the fact, once data comes in. Because when we talk about macroeconomic data, there is almost no real-time macro data. It's all historical. So it takes a bit of time to understand exactly what's happening. We don't have some giant supercomputer where we can find out exactly what amount of consumption is going on today, November 29th or whatever, or how many people are working today and earning what wages. It's historical. So finding out what's going on takes a bit of time. It could take a few months to find out that there's a problem happening in the economy. And from there, it takes time to figure out what to do about it. So if government decides, hey, we're in a recession, then it's, okay, well, what do we do about it? Do we cut taxes? Do we increase government spending? And if so, what spending do we increase and what taxes do we cut? And so there's that sort of debate that goes on about what to do about it. And that could take a while on its own. So while the first lag then becomes the second lag that adds more time on top of that. And then the third is something called the implementation or the operational lag. And that's the time it takes for whatever is decided to actually have an effect on the actual economy, because it takes time to get these things rolling. I know that during the last recession, prior to the one that we've just sort of come out of, the sort of mini recession due to the pandemic, the 08-09 recession, there was a big stimulus plan. It was called the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. It was about $787 billion President Obama signed off on. And he had touted the idea of shovel-ready projects. That is, we get the money approved and we can start, building highways and office buildings and whatnot. But then he sort of discovered that some of these were more shovel-ready than others. It sometimes takes time to make these things happen. So as a result, part of that big stimulus bill was intended for, say, a runway in Doñana County. Well, that's fine. So we will appropriate $500 million or whatever to make a runway in Doñana County. Well, it's not that people are going to start work next week. Somebody's going to draw up plans for it. There's surveys, environmental inspections, contract bids have got to be let, contractors are going to be hired. There are all kinds of things that have to happen. And then the workers can be hired and the work can start. But all this takes time. This is another lag on top of the recognition and administrative lags, all of which can be problematic in the sense that by the time all of these cumulative lags have happened, cumulatively, that is in order, that things may have changed. And so that macro policy that was so pressing a year ago is no longer as pressing. And the best example that I can certainly think of is in the 90-91 recession that was still sort of impacting a lot of the parts of the country in 1992 during a presidential election. Bill Clinton, who was then a candidate for president, talked a lot about stimulus, what we were going to do and all that. As it turns out, all this stimulus that he was proposing was a little bit after the fact, because the economy, even by the time he was elected, was already in recovery. It didn't seem that way to a lot of parts of the country, and it does take time to recover and to recognize that it's happening. And so when the stimulus was passed in his first year in office in '93, it was adding extra bit of boost to the economy that was already in recovery mode. So sometimes these actions are simply too slow. And that's a criticism in general of this process, is that it is slow and works with a lag. Now, there is a lag involved in monetary policy, but it's thought to be of a much lesser duration. So the lags with fiscal policy are much more significant than they are with monetary policy. Okay, and then the final thing I'll talk about here is something that is, and I can't recall if your book talks about this or not in this particular edition. I've been working with McConnell for some time, but it's something called the political business cycle. And it sort of verges a little bit on conspiracy theory, where some people feel like the government will do things to set up the economy so that things look very nice and rosy prior to elections, and then after elections happen, the sky falls in on the economy, and it's meant to be that way because of the political business cycle, and that is that taxes will stay low and government spending will stay high, and everybody will be happy prior to election, particularly the election of incumbents, whether it's a president or members of Congress. And then suddenly after that, then all the tough decisions have to be made, and all the nasty medicine gets meted out. There's not that much evidence for that, honestly, the political business cycle. If there were, I think we would be much more aware of it, and certainly the press would be all over it, I think. But nonetheless, that idea does exist in some quarters, that things are meant to look better than what they are, but in reality, things aren't always as nice as what they're meant to see. Okay, so that sort of does it for chapter 13. Feel free to get with me individually if you do have questions about any of this, and I'll stop the recording here really quickly, and then we'll pick it up with what is a fairly brief chapter as an introduction to money and banking. Okay, so I wanted to wrap up this discussion of today's video, talking about money and money and banking, and sort of an introduction to financial systems, that we can know a bit better about what is going on there, because it's going to play a big part in what we talk about with regard to monetary policy beginning in week 6. So we talk about money. What is money exactly? I know that it's a pretty silly question, perhaps. But we're really talking about something known as a fiat currency, and that is the idea of money is simply pieces of paper and or entries in computer systems. And in other words, it's not backed by any sort of metals. It's not backed by gold or silver or anything like that. It used to be at one time, it has been at various times, been a metals-backed currency, like a lot of currencies. But beginning in 1971, the government went off the gold standard, and the US government did. And it has never really looked back, and it really has never caused that much difficulty, given the fact that there have been problems in sticking to the gold standard, simply because the economy is growing faster than the money supply the gold supply could catch up, based on the current ratio of gold to money. And today it just seems like an impossibility to ever go back in the other direction. So fiat currency, it's simply, legal tender is simply worth what the government says it's worth, and so how does the government maintain the value? It maintains it through monetary policy, which we're going to be getting to shortly. But we do want to sort of lay out some of the background, which is what chapter 16 is really all about, is sort of laying out some of the background of money and finance that will sort of be the backdrop for how monetary policy is implemented. That is the other element of government policy. So in order to describe what money is, sometimes I think it's better to discuss what it does. And money has got really 3 main functions. Sometimes you may Google this and may find there's a 4th function, but in reality, I think most of us will stick with the 3 main functions. And the first of these is what's known as a medium of exchange. Money serving as a medium of exchange is money the way we probably fundamentally first come across knowing it, and that is money to be used to buy things. That is, I want to go buy a cup of coffee, and so I give $1 or $2, whatever it costs. I get the cup of coffee. It's used as an exchange. As opposed to what? Well, as opposed to a barter system, which existed in pre-money times, where there's a real problem with the barter system, and that is there's what's known as a double coincidence of wants. And that is, somebody's got to have what I want, and it's got to be in the right proportion as to what I have that they also coincidentally want. A coincidence of wants, which is very difficult to arrange. And then who says what the value of, what is one horse worth 50 chickens, 20 chickens? What is the exchange value? It becomes very difficult. So money to be used as a medium of exchange in order to overcome the barter problem, which is not to say that barter doesn't exist. And we talked a bit about this idea of barter as existing in some areas, in particular in commercial real estate. There's quite a lot of barter that goes on, where somebody exchanges 50 acres of land on the Rio Parco for 10 acres at Ventura and Paseo or something like that, where the value is considered to be equivalent, even though they're different in denomination. But still, that's among more sophisticated players, and most of these transactions are handled through money. The second is a store of value. Now, these first two, medium of exchange and store of value, are going to come up again and again as we talk about the supply of money and the demand for money, because they both have roles to play in both of those, money supply and money demand. And we'll talk a bit more about money demand next time. But a store of value is basically this: the money can be used either to spend or to save. So a store of value is basically saving money as money. And you don't have to convert it to something else. You can simply save it and withdraw it at some point in order to spend it at a later date. So what money as a store of value would not include will be taking money and buying real estate with it or something like that. That would be a form of savings, but would not be a form of financial savings, which is what we're really getting at here. So money as money. And the third of these is as a unit of account. And this is the way we value things in the economy are in terms of dollars. And this is, or yen or euros or whatever the denomination of currency is that one is dealing with. This is the way that we measure economic values is in monetary terms, and that's the way we assign value. We assign value to everything: wages, spending, deficits, debt, all those kinds of things are all denominated in terms of money. So those are the three main uses of money. The first two of these are going to become important, particularly as we talk about the supply of money. And that's the next topic that we'll get to, and that is the money supply. So we talk about the money supply. We're really talking about two main components, one of which feeds into the other. And so they're what we call a cumulative measure. And the first of these is simply known as M1. Now, if for some reason if you happen upon older textbooks or older slide packages or whatever, where you're talking about very old measures of the money supply, you might see M1, M2, M3, M4, and then something goes beyond M4 called L. Those M3 and M4 have long ago been discarded, and we now only use M1 and M2. There is a hybrid of M2 that your text talks about called MZM. I'm not really going to get into that so much. Instead, I do want to focus on M1. M1 is basically money in liquid form, in a more liquid form. Now, the term liquid, for those of you who had accounting before, simply means the ability to convert something into cash in order to use it right away. So obviously, money in the form of money doesn't get much more liquid than that, does it? So what are we talking about here? We're talking about money that's available immediately. So money in cash, in coin, in checking account deposits, those are available right away without restriction. That's why checking account deposits are known as demand deposits accounts, because they are available on demand. If I write a check to somebody, I'm basically ordering my bank. When it says pay to the order, what it's saying is, not a check, it says pay to the order. I'm ordering my bank to pay that on demand as that presenter that check is written to gets it presented to their bank or to my own bank, whatever. It'll be paid to that person's order. So themselves or to whoever they order it to be paid to by re-endorsing it. So it's in a very liquid form. And it also includes other things besides cash and currency and coin. It also includes things like money orders, traveler's checks. And I know we always include traveler's checks. I'm not even sure how much traveler's checks are even in use anymore. They seem to be used much more before plastic was in use. The advantage of traveler's checks were that if you lost it, you were somewhere out of town, unlike losing cash, or if you lose cash, it's gone. Traveler's checks are registered. You could always get your money back fairly quickly, and so you'd be in good shape if out of it. But now with plastic, if you lose your card, you can get that replaced, or typically people who travel out of town oftentimes book travel ahead of time, so it's already paid for. That's negating the need necessarily to have money right away. You can get that card replaced at some point. But travel checks go into that, money orders, all kinds of instruments go into M1, including this idea of what are called transaction accounts, which include demand deposit accounts at banks, also the similar kind of accounts at credit unions called share draft accounts. The idea of share draft accounts are that theoretically, if you have an account in a credit union, you are a partial owner because they're what are called mutually owned, and that you have a share of the ownership of that credit union. Credit unions being not for profit, so it's a little bit of a hybrid and sort of a theoretical, transcendental sort of relationship. But nonetheless, it would still fall under the category of M1 by being a transaction account, even though it's not a demand deposit account like we know at commercial banks. And they tend to be a non-interest bearing form. Yes, I know that there are checking accounts that do carry interest, so-called money market checking accounts. The rate of interest on those is not much. And in fact, I don't even know to what extent people even have those accounts, because they tend to have higher minimum balances in order to avoid service fees. And with rates so low on everything right now that I don't even know to what extent those are even sold. I can't even tell you the last time I was even solicited by my bank for an interest-bearing checking account. I know the savings account that I have at a bank was paying something like 1/100% for a very long time. I think it may be a little bit higher now, but not very much higher. So if savings is paying that, then what is checking? Probably zero. But it tends to be non-interest-bearing form. The second of these, and M1, by the way, becomes part of M2. So all of M2 includes all of M1, which means M2 is larger. It's larger anyway, but it would be larger even if the non-M1 component were above zero, it'd still be larger because all of M1 goes into M2. But this is a money in a less liquid form, with the exception of M1, okay? Except for the M1 portion, which, because it's cumulative, it folds into that. So it's money in less liquid form except for M1. And it tends to be interest bearing, but not always, okay? And at the moment, because interest rates are so extremely low throughout the economy, which is something we're going to get into more next time, this idea of extremely low rates and what it's doing to our economy, and how long it can be sustained, and whether it should be sustained because of our inflationary environment, and do we need to have higher rates? Some of that will come up again a bit later, but nonetheless, it does tend to be interest bearing under more normal conditions. And it would be nice if we can one day get back to studying macro without saying in more normal times, because for many years now, we really haven't been. Something has been going on, whether it's recovery from the housing crisis and economic recovery and the rebuilding of the financial industry to now the pandemic and whatnot. So we are living in some definitely interesting times from macroeconomics. And I started teaching at a time when there wasn't really much happening in macro. And so we would talk about inflation and unemployment, and it was more abstract. And today it's a real thing, both unemployment and inflation. So M2 includes all of M1. So it's a cumulative measure, and it tends to be in a more interest-bearing form. Okay, these are going to play a much bigger role as we get into talking about money demand. We're talking about money supply. Think about this. Why do we need money in the form of M1? Well, it goes back to the uses of money, and that is money serving as a medium of exchange. So why do I have money in my checking account? Because I plan to spend it, right? I wouldn't probably put all that much money in a checking account as savings. I probably wouldn't put my retirement savings in a checking account or non-interest-bearing account if I had the option of doing something different with it. Why? Because there are other places to go with it, and I don't need it right away. And I would rather commit it in a less liquid form, like an M2. So money as a medium of exchange is almost always M1. That's cash, currency, money in your pocket, money in cash registers, all throughout the economy is M1. M2 then would include, except for the portion that's the M1 portion dealing with a medium of exchange, is more of a store of value. store of value. That is, I'm putting aside money in a savings account because I plan to use it at a different time. So I might put money in savings because I don't need it right away. I didn't spend as much this month as I thought I was going to, so I'll slide some of my paycheck into savings. And by the way, when we talk about M2, and we're talking about money, and we're talking mostly about bank deposits, well, this is mostly checking accounts. These are things like passbook savings, certificates of deposits. It obviously includes all of M1, which is checking, but in addition to that includes passbook savings, CDs like certificates of deposit, some IRA accounts, things of that nature, things of a long, that are a little bit longer duration, and which tend to be more in interest bearing form. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to money. You can read that on your own. Chapter 16 is a fairly easy chapter to follow and go. Is it 16 or is it 14 actually? I keep forgetting here. The chapter doing money and monetary policy. I think it's 16 actually, is it? So is that right? Yeah, I'm kind of wondering on this. Yes, money, that's chapter 14. Sorry, I think I've been saying 16, and I did mean chapter 14. So 13 is fiscal policy, 14 is money and banking. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the nature of our financial system. And there's an interesting discussion in your text about the Federal Reserve. And I do want to talk a bit about the Federal Reserve System because it's an important element of our economy. It's the agent that controls monetary policy, but it does a lot more. And the Federal, and if you look at the slide package that talks about what the Federal Reserve is, it was created a little over 100 years ago in the wake of a real financial crisis. And there was no central bank to intervene in the economy. And as a result, there was a need for it. So, and there have been two subsequent efforts to create something like a central bank in the early 1800s. And that they had 20-year charters from the government. And when they expired, they were not renewed in either case. I think the lessons of that were that we need a central bank, like a lot of all modern economies have. And so what does the Federal Reserve do? Number one, I could say I've long likened the Federal Reserve being both the brains and the brawn of our financial system. The brains in the sense that they can control monetary policy. They do a lot in terms of enforcing bank regulation and whatnot. But they're also the brawn. They also maintain things like currency and coin supply to banks. They maintain wire transfer services. They can store money if money needs to be destroyed. That's worn out, it goes to the Federal Reserve to be destroyed. So all those kind of things are both brains and brawn. I talked about the fact that it was centralized as well as decentralized. Centralized in the sense that the Board of Governors serves in Washington, D.C. There are 7 members on the Board of Governors. They have a 14-year term each. And what's interesting about this, the 7 members of 14 years, every 2 years, theoretically, one will be leaving, one will be coming on. The reality is that, number one, there are often vacancies on the board. So the board has been as small as 4 or 5 members at times instead of 7. It does take time for the president to arrive at a nomination and to pass through Senate confirmation. This is usually not particularly controversial. President Trump did have a couple nominees or would-be nominees that were unacceptable to the Senate. That's pretty unusual. And one who was outright rejected by the Senate, which is a little bit different. Most of the time, these are not particularly controversial, okay? But there are oftentimes vacancies, and sometimes people simply leave before serving out the term. They can serve 14 years of their own term, and then they fill out the remainder of someone else's term. And so the chairman of the Federal Reserve, about 3 chairmen ago, Alan Greenspan, served 14 years of his own term, and then another 5 of someone else's. And so he was actually on the board for 19 years, a very long time. And as chairman, which in that role is only 4 years, but the chairman is a member of the board, and as a result was there for 19 years, a very long stretch as Fed chairman, okay? And then the decentralized notion, there are 12 district banks throughout the country. We tend to be in, we are in Albuquerque, we are in District 10, that's headquartered in Kansas City. But I believe it cuts off of Bernalillo County. I think that Valencia County to the south is actually part of District 9 of the Dallas Fed, I believe. I believe that's right. So I think they're in the part of the Dallas Fed, and District 12 is Kansas City, or it's not San Francisco. Okay, so we're in that particular district, and so it is decentralized, and members of and people who head that up tend to be chosen by the banks within that particular district. And so within the 10th district of the Federal Reserve, it includes Kansas, Oklahoma, part of Texas, part of New Mexico, that is the northern, say, half or so, and I think part of Colorado also. So that's the district, and that's headed, and Esther George is the president currently of our Federal Reserve District. Okay, and then also in Washington, there is something called the Federal Open Market Committee, which, when we talk about the Federal Reserve doing things in terms of monetary policy, it's going to revolve around this FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, which is made up of the members of the board, those 7 members, or however many were on there at the time, which includes the chairman and vice chairman. Those are always members of the board. And then 5 rotating members from the 12 district banks. One of them is a permanent member, and that's the Federal Reserve president of the bank, Federal Reserve of New York. That's considered a permanent member of the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, what does the term open market refer to? Well, it refers to one of the tools that the Fed uses to manage the supply of money and availability of credit. And it's considered to be a powerful tool, and that committee makes the decisions for that. And so whenever you hear on TV, the Federal Reserve did this or did that, it's usually not the board itself, it's usually the FOMC that does it. And they meet every 6 or 8 weeks. I think it's like 6 weeks, and they decide upon the direction of monetary policy. And then they release the minutes of those meetings, that is who said what when, several weeks after the fact, and that people, particularly in the financial industry, will scrutinize those to get an idea of where the Fed is leaning, particularly in terms of what its position is on interest rates. Is it planning to raise rates, which is what a lot of people are suspecting is going to happen, but by how much and what timing is anyone's guess. And so it's sort of an open question at this point. So there's a lot of speculation and a lot of trying to read between the tea leaves as to what the Fed is up to and all that. So and then finally, the functions and responsibilities of the Fed is going to be pretty much the last topic. There's a slide that comes after that, the slide package dealing with money creation, which you can look at on your own. I tend not to cover it too much in this course, just given the more abbreviated nature. It's mostly to support what we're doing as we get into monetary policy. So the Fed is the brains and the brawn in the nation's central bank, issuer of the currency. So if you look at dollar bills in your pocket or in your wallet, it doesn't say Treasury note, it says Federal Reserve note. So it's a product of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is semi-private. I know that sometimes textbooks will say it's a non-governmental agency or it's a private entity. It's not really, it's part of the government. And the Federal Reserve chairman and all the members of the board are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So that makes them part of the government. It's just that they're self-funding. They don't receive any tax dollars, and the Fed wants it that way. That sort of maintains its independence from the political process, which is one reason why the 14-year terms are so important. It's to insulate those members from political considerations, at least theoretically, so that they're not swayed by it. No president's going to be around 14 years, for instance, and so as a result, they are thought to have some immunization from political pressure. How much is debatable? How much of that is debatable, but that's part of the idea. It's also a banker's bank. There are other things that the Fed does. So all banks have accounts at the Federal Reserve. They're called reserve accounts. And so what happens is every time you make a bank deposit, you're creating both an asset and a liability. And if you read chapter 15, you'll know what I mean. It's a liability to the bank primarily. And that is, if I deposit a paycheck, then my money's on deposit. It's an asset to me. An asset being defined as something I own, but it's a liability to the bank. It's something they owe back to me. And I surely hope they feel like they owe it back to me. But it's also an asset to them because they get to use it. And they can put it on deposit in their Federal Reserve Bank. They can move around. They can lend it. They can invest it. They can do whatever I want with my money within whatever is legally allowed for them to do. That is the bank. And that's how banks make money. They use your money, depositors' money, in order to lend to other people. And that's And that's obvious. I don't think anyone is in the dark about what banks do, but that's primarily the function, the economic function they play in the financial system as a financial intermediary. And there's oftentimes there's occasionally some concern when banks are minimized in terms of their role in the economy. When the rise of the non-banks like mutual funds and whatnot, back in the 80s when they became much more popular, then it was going to engage in disintermediation, that is cutting off intermediation between banks and everybody else. That tended to be overblown as a criticism, but now the big concern about money and banking is what about these cryptocurrencies? And that I think we're all sort of learning a lot about. I think we're in uncharted territory, frankly, with all the various cryptocurrencies out there. I mean, Bitcoin is only the most prominent. There are many others that are out there, and what to do about them, because they're not on deposit at a bank. They're not, and those deposits don't become reserves at the Federal Reserve. They don't become loaned throughout the economy. It's primarily money as a medium of exchange, even though some are using it as a store of value because the value of Bitcoin has gone up dramatically, so much dramatically in the last couple of years. It's sort of a new thing. And I wish I could give you more information on it, but it's so new and it's so controversial that I think time is going to tell. I tend to think that a lot of this cryptocurrency is probably going to be either extremely regulated or, as what China has done, simply banned outright. I can't imagine that, but it's going to be difficult to regulate because it's, I mean, you know, who regulates the internet? Really nobody. So it's difficult. Also, they do a lot of other things. Serving as a bank regulator, they do a lot of economic research, particularly at the district level. So in our district, the 10th district, a lot of it's dominated by agriculture. So the economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City are heavily involved in studying things like ranching and farming, and also energy production, because oil and gas is a big contributor to what goes on in District 10. So a lot of that is under research as to what the effects are when there are fluctuations in those particular sectors of the economy. Okay. They also provide guidance to the government, particularly the president and to members of Congress. And then they also maintain those systems that I talked about, the brawny part of the enterprise, that is routing checks and routing electronic transactions. And increasingly, a lot of check traffic has become more imaged and is electronically generated anyway. It is not out of the realm of reason to imagine that checks themselves will probably, they're already not in wide use that much anymore. I think I write one check a month, and that's about it. And I've had checks for years sitting around, and probably 3 addresses ago with the address of the checks. But they're still out there, and but anymore they're converted to electronic transactions. And a lot of that had to do with simply the fact that checks were too slow. Writing a check was too slow, clearing a check was too slow, et cetera. So the world is moving faster, and that includes the monetary system. So the Federal Reserve does a lot of things. And what we're going to be focusing primarily on beginning Thursday is its role as a monetary regulator. And in particular, what the Federal Reserve does in order to prevent against inflation on the one hand, or recession and unemployment on the other. And that's the direction we are going to take when we come back on Thursday, as we'll finish up the discussion of stabilization policy, which leaves us then to just talking about some other theoretical issues in macroeconomics, including some of the schools of thought that dominate the discussion. So meantime, feel free to contact me. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. And I will see you all on Thursday.